This is Hino's the Sport, bringing you that heat and that fire. We keeping a foot on the what? On the next. We keeping a foot on the what? On the next. Let's talk about it, man. We got to talk about this miniseries. Roy Jones Jr. is a DuckTales. A DuckTales. There's a stranger out to find you. There's a stranger out to find you. What to do is grab on you some DuckTales. Roy Jones Jr. is ducking Antonio Tarver so that he can fight the likes of a Mike Tyson. We as a boxing community, and when I say we, I'm talking about everyone that are boxing fans, globally, all across the board, have to hold these fighters accountable when they're doing the DuckTales. A DuckTales. There's a stranger out to find you. There's a stranger out to find you. What to do is grab on you some DuckTales. When they are ducking, we have to call them out. Roy Jones Jr. is ducking Antonio Tarver because Antonio Tarver has mentally scarred him. And you guys have to understand when I say mental scarring, what that means. Roy Jones Jr.'s rise to flame, and when I say rise to fame, I'm talking about his stake as being a boxer that we know as the guy that pretty much had the run that he had in the 90s. It had a lot to do with the fact that Roy Jones Jr. fought off of instincts and Roy Jones Jr. fought off of reflexes. That was fine and dandy when Roy Jones Jr. was athletic and explosive, right? And he still had his legs under him. Once he stopped losing his legs, once his legs started giving out on him, once there started to show slippage in his ability to have those same level of reflexes or instincts, shots were starting to land. See, what people have to understand with Roy Jones Jr., he's not the most savvy boxer. His boxing ability looks so good because his instincts and his reflexes were something we've never seen in boxing. We can give him that if we don't give him anything. The greatest instincts, the greatest reflexes we've ever seen in the sport of boxing. And that's why he had the run that he had in the 90s. But then we also have to look at the opponents that he faced. Most of the opponents that he faced were people that you could look at and you'd be like, Roy should have easily dominated those guys. But there are opponents that Roy faced that you got to give him credit. He beat up Bernard Hopkins, a young Bernard Hopkins. He beat up James Toney. That right there was probably the fight that when you think of Roy Jones Jr. and his legitimacy as a fighter in the 90s, that would be the fight that classified him. The fight between him and James Toney, because both of those guys were climbing up the ranks. Both of those guys were fighters that everyone was afraid to fight. Stylistically, their fights just made more sense because James Toney was more of that conventional style boxer that operated in the Philly shell shoulder roll stance, another variation fighter in a higher weight class that wasn't Floyd Mayweather-esque, but as close as you could get when it comes to the Philly shell shoulder roll. And he was very impressive as a boxer / puncher, because that's what he was labeled as, boxer, puncher. Roy Jones Jr., on the other hand, was a guy who had sheer ability to feel his opponents through his instincts, sheer ability to feel his opponents through his reflexes. This made him special. You see this iteration in Gervonta Tank Davis. This is why I've always said Gervonta Tank Davis is the Mighty Mouse iteration or combo package of Roy Jones Jr. meets Mike Tyson. It's because of those instinct abilities and those reflex abilities that a Gervonta Tank Davis possessed that we haven't seen since the likes of a Roy Jones Jr. And we probably are not going to see it anytime soon after these two are long gone. But the point that I'm making is Roy Jones Jr. was due to eventually get exposed. Antonio Tarver knew this. In their first fight, when they fought, the commotion that Roy Jones Jr. said was, well, I had to go all the way up in weight and fight a heavyweight in Ruiz, and then I had to bring myself back down. Now, there could be some credence to what Roy Jones Jr. was saying there. But we know in boxing, excuses are the measure of our assholes. They basically amount for nothing. Let me say it again. Excuses are the same measures of our asshole. They basically amount for nothing. They excrete crap out of it. So I get that you had to go up, but the bottom line is your natural weight class was light heavyweight. And if you felt you wasn't ready to fight Antonio Tarver as your next opponent, then you didn't have to fight him. But the reason why you fought Antonio Tarver is because you thought that he was just like those long lists of opponents for a long period of time that Roy Jones Jr. was fighting, that he could just step into the ring, play basketball, and get by. Because Roy Jones Jr. was doing this. See, a lot of people that don't know Roy Jones Jr., I don't know him personally, but I follow his boxing career very extensively, especially being a fighter that's a fellow Floridian. You know a thing or two about certain fighters. And one of the things that Roy Jones Jr. got engaged into was he would play basketball and then go into a fight and then fight because he just didn't respect his opponents. Not to say that happened with Antonio Tarver, because in that fight, prior to that fight, he fought a heavyweight and he had to come back down in weight to fight him. So that didn't happen. But in that fight against Antonio Tarver, Roy Jones Jr. started what we call the epic decline of his instincts and his reflexes no longer being there. Antonio Tarver did something to Roy Jones Jr. that nobody expected. Only but those that are true boxing connoisseurs and purists, and those that saw these inevitable weaknesses that were going to get exposed from Roy Jones Jr., which was once he started to slip, once he started to show slippage or wanage in his athleticism and his explosion, somebody was going to get his ass. Somebody was going to nail him. And once they nailed him, then we were going to see what he was made of. Antonio Tarver is the boxer that single-handedly took the aura of invincibility away from Roy Jones Jr. Let me say it again. Antonio Tarver is the boxer that took the aura of invincibility from Roy Jones Jr. So you would think, with Roy having that in the back of his mind, he would want to have a third fight with this guy. If we're going to have old geezers fights, it needs to be old geezers that make sense. Let me say it again. If we're going to have old geezers that are going to fight, these old geezers need to make sense. Meaning they need to be fighters that were in the same weight class. They're naturally fit and built for one another. And don't give me this cockamamie nonsense that Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson would just do no better numbers. Bullshit. Roy's never been naturally a heavyweight. Mike Tyson is naturally a heavyweight. So this fight is really a sideshow. It's a major dud. It makes no sense. And these two old geezers are looking for money. I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. Let's just keep it real. Let's keep it a buck, and let's keep it 100. But the dancing partner that makes the more absolute sense would be Antonio Tarver, because there's unfinished business. This is the guy that single-handedly took the aura of invincibility away from you. I would think that Roy Jones Jr. would want that get back. But deep down, what I'm sensing from Roy Jones Jr., and I know a lot of people in the boxing community is sensing it, is a DuckTales, woo, a DuckTales, woo. There's a stranger out to find you. There's a stranger out to find you. What to do is grab on you some DuckTales, woo. Roy Jones Jr. is ducking Antonio Tarver because he is mentally scarred. Antonio Tarver has left something there that Roy Jones Jr. does not want to revisit. Let me say it again, because what I said was so deep and profound. So hear me. Wow. This one needs to marinate in the corpus callosum and in the cerebellum. Roy Jones Jr. does not want to fight Antonio Tarver because Antonio Tarver mentally scarred him. And that's just a Pandora's box that Roy Jones Jr. doesn't want to open up. But if you're a true fight fan, you need to be asking the question that He Knows the Sport asked this weekend. Why are we getting a cockamamie sideshow major dud of Roy Jones Jr. versus Mike Tyson when we should be getting Roy Jones Jr. versus Antonio Tarver? And the simple answer is this. A DuckTales, woo! A DuckTales, woo! There's a stranger out to find you. There's a stranger out to find you. What to do is grab on you some DuckTales. Woo! Bottom line is this. Roy Jones Jr. does not want that free smoke from Antonio Tarver, fellow Floridian, and he knows that if he steps into a ring with a guy that comparable to him, still in shape, more natural to him in terms of weight class, and would make more sense from a common sense standpoint in terms of an old geezer's fight, Roy Jones knows that if he opens up those skeletons, he's not going to like what he sees. And I believe because of the insecurity and the misery that's associated behind that opponent and them getting at it again, Roy Jones Jr. is officially a DuckTales. Woo! A DuckTales. Woo! There's a stranger out to find you. There's a stranger out to find you. What you do is grab on you some DuckTales. Woo! He's ducking Antonio Tarver. And if you are a true boxing head and you're using the true boxing eye test, you would hold him accountable for this. I keeps the foot on the what? On the next. I keeps the foot on the what? On the next. This is Hino's Sport. Check it out.